Welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Caplan. I'm joined today by Dr. Laura Sykes. We'll be discussing her recently published essay, Rolling Stone Magazine, Co-opting the Counterculture. Today's episode is about tension between aesthetics and politics, between counterculture and capitalism, and between what something claims to be and what it actually does in the world. And we start by looking at her work on rock criticism, especially figures like Richard Goldstein, Willis, Lester Bangs, and Jann Wenner. But very quickly, the conversation opens up into the role of the magazine Rolling Stone and how it helped shape not just the music culture, but the way people understood themselves as part of a movement, even when the political commitments behind that movement were continually in conflict. Along the way, we talk about things like the use of New Left aesthetics without the politics behind them, the role of gender and race in music criticism, and how ideas get packaged, circulated, and sometimes stripped of their original meaning. There are moments where we zoom in on specific articles and specific figures, and others when we back up and think about the larger question, what does it mean for a culture to feel radical without necessarily being? If you like what we do here, please subscribe to the show at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm here blessed to be with the wonderful Dr. Laura Sykes. She is from West Monroe, Louisiana. So if I think it's hot in New Jersey, it's probably hotter there. So shout out to just dealing with that. Actually, no, you're in Texas, so maybe even hotter. So she attended the Louisiana State University for her undergraduate degree, earning a PhD at the University of Rochester, studying under Joan Shelley Rubin. The focus of her research is rock and roll criticism from its origins into the 1960s through today. Of particular interest to her are cultural hierarchies, radical politics, print culture, race, and gender. Her dissertation, In the Groove, Rock Criticism from 1966 to 1978, examines Richard Goldstein, Willis, Lester Bangs, and Jann Wenner, analyzing their contributions to musical, cultural, and political discourse, which is, of course, what we'll be discussing largely speaking today. She is currently adapting it for publication as a book. She's an assistant professor at the history of history at Texas A&M University, Texarkana. There, she runs the Red River Center for Regional History and Culture. She is also the editor of the Red River series for the Texas A&M University Press and is a strong proponent of public history, which makes perfect sense because you are joining us here in a public situation. So thank you so much for joining us, especially on something like a Friday when everyone's tired and wants to sleep, of course, me included in that. Now, I had a really great time reading through this piece. I found the history sort of very straightforward and wonderfully written out. And what was interesting, I thought, was sort of there's no like, this works, it worked. There was no sort of original like motive of kind of like thinking through the history. There was no like lens. You sort of had the history and the archives create the lens in different ways. You had demarcations of different things where you have like hippie capitalism, and the various sort of social factions at play. But so a lot of that history sort of ends up working and speaking for itself. I also was immediately struck by this as a writing sort of note that you didn't have sections in this piece. Um, and I thought that was such an interesting sort of thing. So would you mind talking a little bit about where this piece comes from? Because I know it comes from your larger dissertational work, which I would love to sort of perhaps get into as well. And I'm excited to see it turn into a book as well. If you wouldn't mind talking about the ways in which you wrote the chapter, how it came about, its relationship to your dissertation, and then we could get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, so I suppose being a teacher, I'm always thinking about sections. I feel like students oftentimes are reading stuff on the internet all the time and they have this impulse to break things into sections. And I'm always saying, how about we try some artful transitions instead? And so whenever I was writing this, I just really, was sticking to that. I just thought maybe I could make it flow. I tried to do so. And it's coming as a chapter from a chapter in a book, or in my dissertation. So I thought it would work. And yeah, I mean, the thing about this topic is that it really does speak for itself. I mean, all you have to do is look at the material and you'll, likely come to the same conclusions that I did when you're examining this aspect of it. My advisor, Joan Shelley Rubin, who's awesome, she did like middlebrow culture. That was her thing. Like in the 80s and the 90s, it was really big, making middlebrow culture by Levine. And then she's part of that. She wrote, or sorry, he did highbrow, lowbrow, and she does making a middlebrow culture. And so coming from her, she really does a lot of textual analysis because she's a historian of the press and of writing. And so I think that approach really helped me in going into this, having that training in textual analysis as really the rooting for what I'm doing. Because when you can have the writings to speak for itself, you don't have to say as much, right, to make the argument effective.
Yeah, really brilliant. And I was so impressed that actually you were able to lay out such history so clearly without demarcating specific spaces. Because you don't see that too often. And I'm surprised also that the editors of the journal didn't say something like, hey, put this here, hey, put this here. But
They
it
they
definitely
liked
flows
it as it
very cool.
they
But it
liked it
definitely,
as it was, and they didn't ask me actually to make changes. So I was able to keep that original formatting, and it was very, very positive.
that's great. Great storyteller. So there's this different ideas happening within it. And you kind of mentioned textual analysis, but you also get into sort of graphical analysis. And what are some of the ways in which graphic analysis works to understand Rolling Stone magazine, especially sort of in terms of it kind of its quote unquote underground press to then popular cultural to mainstream sort of pipeline? How do the visuals specifically play a role in that? And also, as a second part of the question, what role does sort of the visuals and politics and gender and race play? I know this is a lot, but you cover it.
Yeah, so what I'm really looking at in this chapter is um, how some of the aesthetics of the New Left are used by Rolling Stone magazine very consciously in order to appeal to members of the New Left without importing the political content along with it, right? And by that, I don't mean the political content of the magazine. I mean the political content of the New Left, the Marxism, anti-capitalism specifically, as part of this. And that's really where the hitch comes in, because it's not really about style, although style comes into the story because that's part of the co-optation, right? It's about whether this magazine is a part of the New Left or not, and how it is, trying to convince readers that it is without actually fulfilling those commitments. Whenever I was talking to Richard Goldstein, who is one of my other subjects, and he is the very first rock critic, and I identify him in my book as being a pioneer. He said that when he invented the genre of rock criticism, he envisioned his work as the as the cultural wing of the political movement. Okay, so he's looking at talking about rock and roll and talking to audiences about rock and roll in specific ways as a political project. And so whenever Jann Wenner comes along with Rolling Stone, he's going to put all of the bells and whistles of this approach in the magazine without that anti-capitalist content, right? So we have all of the trappings without the sort of central pillar of what's going on. And so what Jann Wenner is able to do is, for example, he comes out of this new left radical scene that's happening in Berkeley during the free speech movement, but he's kind of never really in it. He's always just there watching it. And he goes and at one point he's going to work for Ramparts and work at Sunday Ramparts, this new left magazine, which is explicitly new left and anti-capitalistic. And he is going to use the aesthetics of that magazine to inform the aesthetics of the new magazine that he's creating, but he's not importing that content along with it. So the aesthetics are not important in that they make or break whether Rolling Stone is a valuable, asset to either the new left or American culture. that's just the signaling that he uses to get the audience, right? And the aesthetics are going to continue to be very good throughout, Rolling Stone's time as a magazine. But they're masking sort of the lack of deeper analysis that's going on in there, and perhaps convincing Americans in a way that that's not a part of rock criticism, that that's not important, that you can be countercultural without that core pillar of counterculturalism, right? So it kind of reminds me of like of Paul Fass's assessment of the flappers in the 1920s, where it's like all the aesthetic, but without the sort of political content. You know what I'm saying? And so this is what Jann Wenner is doing. And by doing so, he's able to capture the market, which is an anti-capitalist market, and therefore become, a multimillionaire, very rich person off of this, which he, is itself neglecting that anti-capitalistic core of the new left. So I think it's all tied together. It's not about the aesthetics, right? It doesn't matter what the thing looks like, except for that it's a little bit of a trick, a little bit of smoke and mirrors to convince the audience that he's doing something there that he's not.
Yep, totally. I mean, and you make that abundantly clear within the piece, and also you lay out some of Jann Wenner's biographical aspects as well. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the founder of this, his relationship to Ralph Gleason, and some of the early years of the magazine, and then we could get into the internal and sort of external contradictions regarding the magazine, including the editorial staff and some of the unrest within those figures. And then, of course, my favorite part of hearing about the criticism was coming from the feminist sort of response to this.
Yeah. So Jan Wenner is from a sort of wealthy background. He went to a boarding school when he was young, and he actually is going to change his name from Jan, Jan, with one N. He's going to add in the second N to give himself a little more of an air of mystery, I suppose, maybe a little Europeanness. So for me, that the reason I say that is because it signals to me that he really wants to be like cool and looked at as like sort of mysterious and interesting from a very early age. But like I said, he is from an affluent background. Now, we know from the history of the New Left that being from an affluent background is no limitation to being a part of this movement that, let's face it, was pretty bourgeois. It has a lot of college students from upper middle class backgrounds and things like that. So it's but he's never going to sort of abandon that connection, I suppose, is the important thing. We have him in the middle of what's going on around 1964 in Berkeley, California. You have, Mario Savio and like the free speech movement. And so it's a time when students on campus are fighting for the new left causes. Okay. One of those being free speech, anti-Vietnam, divestment, some really important issues in the universities. And from the observations that people at the time made, Jann Wenner was always there when like an action was going on, but he was never involved in the action, right? He's always just a little bit further away looking at it or watching it. It's almost as though in some of these descriptions, it's almost as though he wants to be sort of seen as a part of it, but without risking anything, I suppose, or maybe fully committing. I'm not sure. I'm not in his head, obviously, but this is sort of the descriptions that we get from him. He's gonna really kind of porn his way in. I don't know. That might seem like a kind of a rude word to say, but he's going to press his way. He's going to move into these sort of circles of leftism in Berkeley, and he's going to begin writing about some of the scene that's going on there, and he's going to write for the Sunday Ramparts, as I mentioned, which is kind of the spinoff of Ramparts, which is a countercultural newspaper, which is basically founded by this trust fund kid's $600,000 that he donated at one point to create the magazine. And it is very, very strongly new left. Okay, it's anti COINTELPRO. It is exposing things going on in Vietnam. It is, as as we say, speaking truth to power in a lot of ways. And so when he's working for with them, he meets this guy named Ralph Gleason, and Ralph Gleason is a long time music critic from San Francisco. And he is a jazz critic. He's a guy who was listening to jazz when other people said that it was degenerate music. And he said, it ain't degenerate music and it swings and I love it. And he, really promoted it, right? And so he is going to connect with Jann Wenner, who is very interested in youth culture. And they're going to talk a lot about music, including rock and roll music. And Jann Wenner is going to become kind of a mentor for not only Jann Wenner, but some of the young leftist writers, especially when it comes to cultural stuff like music and stuff. So when Ramparts folds, they're going to begin Rolling Stone, and Ralph Gleason is going to have like limited involvement, especially after the beginning. He's sort of like the spiritual godfather of the project, rather than more of a day-to-day, worker on it. And they're going, and what Jann Wenner is going to do is he's going to take specifically the styling the of Ramparts. So Ramparts is part of what we call the underground press. When you study print culture, this is sort of a part of the important part of the print culture of the 1960s. There's this really great book on it by Jesse Kornbluth called, oh God, what is it? Flaming Typewriters, something like that. I can't remember the exact name of it, but you can Google him. What's happening is, the print media is dominated by vested interests in this country, just like everything else. And the left wants to have an independent voice from that. And so all across America in cities, especially, we're seeing little underground newspapers pop up. A lot of them are on like pulped newsprint, where you can like literally see the quality is a lot worse than what you would get in Life magazine or something like that. And that's part of the signaling, right? These aesthetics. Well, at the time, it's not really an aesthetic choice, right? It's a financial choice, and it's maybe even a political commitment, right? But for Wenner, it's going to become an aesthetic choice exclusively. So he's going to take this sort of underground newspaper style. It has like these rough edges, and certain blocking. He's also going to take the drop R of Rolling Stone. You have a big drop R that you're familiar with. If you Google it, you'll know what it looks like. He's going to take that from the Sunday Ramparts and put it in his magazine as well. But the goals of the two things are entirely different, even if they look the same. Because from day one, the goal of Ramparts was to increase political awareness of important issues to the new left. And from day one, the goal of Rolling Stone is to turn a profit. And that's going to be the core of this disconnect that's going to happen between what we're presenting and what we're getting.
Yeah, that's very much still an issue. Just different aesthetic and cultural co-optations and whatnot. Like defanging is usually a current term that's kind of used to talk about it, sort of like a lot of folks are like, well, Black Lives Matter died when Target started selling T-shirts and all of these sorts of things. So you always have the selling out of the movement in various ways, no matter what that kind of movement ends up being. And there's some movements that are really hard to co-op, specifically like the Palestinian sort of movement seems to be like a particularly hard thing to co-op. It's like I don't know if you're going to see really keffiyehs or whatnot sold in Target in the same way. Um, you know,
You never know, though, right?
you never
Well,
know.
the thing is about the containing it, like once you capture it, you're able to sort of contain it. And then these these signals become completely divorced, right, from their original meaning, because now they're just aesthetic and no content, right? But we can't forget that there's someone who divorces them. In this case, we know the people who are divorcing them. We can't just act like it just happens, which is very convenient. But as historians, we have to depend on historicity. We have to go in and figure out, where are they getting the divorce, right? Where's the content being pulled apart from the medium that we have working?
Yeah, that's great.
And I argue that a lot of that has to do with Jann Wenner. And you mentioned, it's very hard to get a hold on Palestine. Well, I'll say that what comes through in the literature in 1966, 1967 is that it was very hard for them to get a hold of this rock counterculture in terms of profiting off of it. And really, it is Jann Wenner's innovations that make that possible, right? So it was something that lots of people have been trying ever since, the youth culture started in the 50s, but especially since like the Beatles and the 63 and all of this, they've been trying and trying. I mean, we had Hearst magazine tried a magazine called Hearst Publications called a magazine called Cheetah, which was a really slick, like groovy, like, let's get all the cool hip writers in here writing on this, and we're going to get the coolest rock stars on the cover and the coolest artists to do it. And it was just a flop. It just didn't work because it was trying too hard or something. People just didn't vibe with it, right? So big media conglomerates had seen money, 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 money. How can you not see money when you're looking at this? These are the boomers. There are 50 million of them, right? And so if you can capture that market, you can become immensely wealthy. But none of them are able to do it. And it's only this guy who's kind of who's like kind of marginally involved with the movement himself, who really understands the aesthetic of it, who's going to be the one who's able to complete that sort of divorce.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly important. I mean, rather than just take things for granted, we should look at the various historical processes that led to this co-optation and whatnot. That's a great reminder. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind getting into like some of the early criteria that was in the Rolling Stones magazine, specifically things like that talk about sort of like rock and roll's co-optation and what like the ethical commitments within rock and roll and how some of these ventures were exploited and the sort of the weirdness in having some of these articles within the Rolling Stone magazine.
Yeah, so in a way, the problem is apparent, especially in the early magazine. By the time you get a few years into it, they've settled into a group that they have created for themselves, and it works. And it's not so jarring. Some of these distinctions, because you kind of know what to expect by that point. But an article that I think is really telling about the sort of nature of what Rolling Stone is doing and its relationship with what's going on within the actual left is the famous article from, I believe, 1967 on groupies, in which they have this multi-page spread with many photos of groupies as a phenomenon. So in this case, not a band or anything like that, but just the phenomenon of groupies. What is a groupie? And I think it's interesting when we're thinking about not only feminism, but the sexual politics of the 1960s and the New Left, and how this is a really sort of one of those examples that you described that's really jarring. If you're going to this magazine to look for a left perspective, you'll quickly realize that you'll not find it here. So what this article does is it basically describes groupies as young women who want nothing but more in life than to have sex with rock stars, that this is, the core of who they are and their role in the culture. They're not creating anything. They're viewed as almost a joke. There's a lot of slut shaming going on in the article that's directed at the women who are the groupies, but not directed at the rock stars or the men who are having sex with the groupies. And at the time, women's role, and still today, but at the time, women's role in rock and roll was very marginalized, right? And so this is some of the most at length sort of writing they've had up to this point on women, is from this perspective of them as sexual objects for men. There's no real agency given to the women, and there's no real attempt to, because from Rolling Stone's perspective, we're supposed to identify really with the males, right? When we're reading that, we're not supposed to be necessarily wanting to know more about the inner lives of the groupies. We want to know more about these sexual interactions and how the men view them. And so it's just a really degrading article about women coming from a very strongly male perspective. I will say, Jann Wenner is a gay man, so I'm not saying that he's projecting his own views on sex on women into this article, right? Instead, I think what he's doing is pandering to what he knows, sort of mainstream America will prefer. Do they want an article about burning our bras at the Miss America pageant, or do they want an article about women as groupies? Because these things are happening simultaneously. And so women within the movement, within the counterculture, are really being reduced to a sexualized, infantilized role. And it is lascivious. It is, titillating, designed to sell magazines. You see that on the cover of a magazine. Oh, groupies, you know what you're going to get. You're not really expecting them to break it down on like women's oppression, let's be honest. But in my mind, that's what a true leftist magazine should have done, and they don't. So, are they any worse than the other magazines that are publishing at the time? No, probably not. But are they leftist? They're not. They're not leftist in that way.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you so much. And also, it just makes me think of kind of the male power or like the patriarchal sort of like dream of what being a rock star will give you access to. Like if you buy this magazine and study the music and start a band, you will have access to this plethora of beautiful women whenever you want that have just like nothing else to do but to follow you around forever. Like that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, it makes
And
them whole. That's their whole purpose on this earth, right?
right.
I mean, it's shocking. And you're right. I think that's a really interesting perspective to imagine the at-home reader thinking, if I achieve my dreams as a rock star, then I can have unlimited access to teenage women who will have meaningless sex with me too. There probably
Yeah.
aren't a whole lot of women who are sitting at home thinking the same thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. The two different readers and what the sort of takeaway and what they're learning is and what the various roles are. It becomes really rock and roll as a sort of patriarchal conquest of like female flesh in various ways. Um, which I could see in different ways. And there's also this weird sort of sexual politics that comes across of like the white male gaze towards blackness within Rolling Stone in different ways. But I guess before we'll get to that in a second, but I also really quickly like I thought this was such a good sort of like kind of counter attack in different ways, and I feel like this cut so deep was the sort of reaction from the feminist magazine and their scathing criticism. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind saying something about that aspect you wrote.
Well, one of the beautiful things about this dissertation is that I got to know a person named Ellen Willis, who is a radical feminist, a co-founder of Red Stockings with Shulamith Firestone, and the first female rock critic, which is why she's in my dissertation about rock criticism. So as a friend of Ellen Willis, so to speak, I knew perfectly well that women had things to say about this because I'd been reading them. I'd been reading what women are saying in response to this. So I knew that it wasn't nothing. I knew that women weren't just laughing it off. I knew that it mattered and people really cared. And so there are a few magazines Off Our Backs is a really great radical feminist magazine. And I believe that I can't remember exactly what I brought in, but I referred to that in this. And Off Our Backs takes a radical feminist perspective, saying that this is perpetuating the sexualization of women, the marginalization of women within rock and roll. And let me tell you that the marginalization of women within rock and roll is not just happening in the pages of that article. It's happening in the office every single day. Women are not allowed to do the same, to perform the same roles that men were in Rolling Stone. In the office, they're going to actually have to have a sit-in at one point in order to get some more equal treatment. Women are viewed as secretarial. And so many of the women who are around, like Ellen Willis, like the women who are writing in Off Our Backs, know fully well that Jann Wenner doesn't like working with women, and what his attitude towards women is like. So again, they're taking it seriously. I think we have a tendency to kind of blow this kind of thing off, like, let's just have some fun with it, guys. But what they know and what they express is that Jann Wenner is not only speaking to an entire generation of young men, but he's helping to shape them, right, in his own image, or in the image of the magazine, or in the image of what rock and roll is projected as in the magazine. And they say that this is not only not an accurate description of women's role in the scene, but also a harmful stereotype that at the very moment when women are trying to break out of these cultural roles is serving to perpetuate them. And so one of the beautiful things about having a very active radical feminist discourse in our society is being able to look and find, where's the counter to this? Who's talking back? And some of these women would end up, taking on Rolling Stone throughout their careers, and not just Rolling Stone, but the patriarchal culture that sort of is perpetuated by them.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for the thorough response. I think it was a real sort of zinger when the response was sort of like, well, if you're talking about groupies and complaining about them in various ways, actually, Rolling Stone is probably the biggest groupie there is, this entire magazine, this entire enterprise.
That's
Uh,
so good, right?
I I was like, oh, like it felt like a slam dunk. Um, that was yeah. If you want to say anything about that specifically, you can.
Sick. I wish I was cool like that, man. They got it.
Totally. So yeah, I mean, this also speaks to like various sort of like third world kind of feminists. We're thinking about the limits of the sort of sexual revolution and what that means. And here we kind of see that very clearly, like, okay, well, you're having sex with multiple people and it might undermine sort of like bourgeoisie Western kind of sexual politics and monogamy and kind of marriage expectations. But at the same time, you are still being considered and treated as an object as such, which is an interesting sort of take because it's like, at one sense, giving agency to oneself and one's desires, but at the same time, your desires are also being like held up and acted upon by the patriarchal systems that undermine them in the first place. Um,
Yeah,
and
we see this appearing throughout the new left, right? Because we're doing free love, because we're getting freaky, like that means sexual equality. And there are a lot of women who are going to have to say, no, we need to nail this down. You need to understand that we can, especially Ellen Willis. I mean, she was what a proto sex positive person. She kind of helped found that view of feminism. She was deep into the pro porn, anti porn debates of the 1980s. And she said, hey, this isn't about us saying that women can't enjoy sex. Women do enjoy sex, and they should get to enjoy sex. But sexuality is not the be all and end all of liberation. We need to move further than that, and that's kind of where we see, again, an aesthetic of liberation without the deeper political commitment, right? The aesthetic of liberation is let's all have sex. The deeper political commitment is let's all have sex in a society that views us equally.
yeah, no, that's great. There's a lot of various like aesthetics without the sort of like underlying meaning or something involved with this. But I was wondering if you would also kind of talk about, so we talked a little bit about female representation within, and I very much mean representation in the sense of being like represented as particular objects of something. I was wondering if you
Mhm.
wouldn't mind touching on race in this regard as well. And then even sort of like race and gender and how these two things work together in different ways within the magazine throughout its years. Stuff in the article or stuff you've looked at and noticed, things like this.
Yeah, I mean, Rolling Stone is worse on race than it is on gender. If you gonna make, no one's making me make that comparison, but I will. Like, they're gonna get, I think it mirrors some deep, deep problems that we have in this country in general, but they're going to be more ameliorative to the women's demands and needs, much quicker, much more responsive, even if not satisfactorily, right, than they are to African American issues. We're not very far from a period in the 1950s when we still had race records as a category in musical charting, right? So we have to remember, and the first chapter of the book is really contextualizing where we're coming from with this. We have to remember that this is brand new, in the historical sort of perspective. And so Jann Wenner seems to, sort of think of Black music in many ways as a separate issue, like a separate thing, right? As something that's in a way like not as business. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not what we do. We know in reality that rock and roll is very deeply indebted to Black music, that some of the best practitioners of rock and roll are Black musicians, writers, producers. But it's almost as though for him, it seems tangential to the core of what he's doing there, which is for young white men. Okay. You just really get the sense that that's his imagined audience, right? Is the young white male. And it's going to be into I believe the 1970s before Rolling Stone even gets its first Black writer on staff. And this is well known throughout the period. And it's not just Rolling Stone. I do want to say that rock criticism in general has a race problem, especially in those early years. There are very few voices from people of color who are making an impact in mainstream music criticism of rock and roll. So I will say that the the treatment of African American music and African Americans in the magazine varies. We have different people who are writing for the magazine, okay? And we also have people who are not staff writers who are writing, coming in and out. And I happen to know that some of the people who were writing for Jann Wenner in the early days were very deeply committed to civil rights and racial equality, like John Lydon, Sue Lydon. They've displayed that throughout other publications. So I don't want to put everyone in the same basket together when it comes to it. But overall, what we see is far more attention on white artists, and the othering in some cases of Black artists. And we also see some looseness around language that I find kind of reprehensible in some cases. I think that that's also a problem within rock and roll in general. I think the New Left thought that they could be using some words that they couldn't be using and some phrases that they shouldn't have been, necessarily using themselves. So usually it's almost like when it's not that they don't talk about Black music. How are you going to talk about rock and roll without talking about Black music? I mean, and it's half reverential, right? This is a worshipped, like but we're not hearing from Black voices, okay? And when I say we're not hearing from Black voices, we're not only not hearing from Black voices as writers, they're not interviewing as many Black people, right? They're not sort of delving into the inner life of Black people as much as usual. And we just see a lack of attention paid to it. I wouldn't say there's a lot of overtly racist content in the magazine. It's more of an exclusion, uh, sort of divide that he's going to sort of create between these two aspects of rock music. Um, Eventually, they are going to bring on more people of color to the magazine and improve their reputation in that area as the 60s go on. But again, the civil rights movement was sort of what the free speech movement evolves out of, right? All of the new left is deeply, deeply indebted to civil rights and to the fight for racial equality in America. And again, none it doesn't appear in the pages of the magazine. All right, that fight, that commitment doesn't appear in the pages of the magazine. Um, we see that African Americans are sort of mostly referred to in an othering sort of way, without being seen as a core part of the process itself or rock and roll. It's the rock and roll scene that Rolling Stone wants to capture.
Yeah, that's great. And so many of the various movements coming out of the 60s and 70s come from the long array of the Black liberation struggle. Like Eugene Perrier says that like when Black people move, the world moves, or to paraphrase it, I think I missed the phrasing a little bit, but it's essentially that sort of thing. And when there is kind of different aspects of Blackness mentioned, it's usually actually within, as you said, couched in like wild sort of terms and ways. So when there is a discussion of soul music, they sort of mention it in very like weirdly derisional sort of turns where they're like, soul music can't think outside of itself. It has no future, right? And it really feels like they're actually talking about what they think of a certain, these types of people rather than the music per se. And this really comes out
Yes,
in the
exactly. Objectifying in a way, right? So putting in that there's a distance between that and between them and the subject that's not there when they're talking about white people. And it's the same thing with like women and stuff, right? And that kind of thing is hard to put your finger on, but yeah. So exoticizing, I think, is some of what we see from some of the authors. Again, though, it does vary by the writer themselves, right? Some of them are sort of more with it and some of them are not. Again, though, at the end of the day, when we're talking about this chapter, which is about a magazine rather than a specific writer, the buck stops at the publisher, right? Which in this case is going to be Jann Wenner, the guy who's behind all of those decisions. So we might have some relatively hip with it writers coming in, but we might not, right? And the general tone overall is somewhat dismissive and othering, I would say. And then of course we have the actual labor problem, which is they're not hiring Black people. And if you want dismissive othering writing about Black people, well, don't hire Black people. That's how you get it, right? So the reason it's happening is fundamentally at the core an issue of who they're hiring and who they're not hiring.
Yeah, that's great. I think, well, when people think of rock and roll, they don't necessarily even think about sort of the Black roots of the music. This and also like kind of country music as well. That's variously erased, which there's definitely a resurgence of people thinking about too, like Rhiannon Giddens and Black Banjo Renaissance sort of stuff going on. Um, there seems to also be, I guess there was this aspect of sort of when they do mention kind of Black music, it's done within white figures, which happened. So like they're talking about sort of certain bands and they're saying that like these bands understand Blackness and Blackness is a state of mind and, it's something you could put on and take off at the end of the day. Like it's all of these kind of old, problematic sort of things that we've more or less discussed in various ways throughout the times. This was also occurring sort of to me during the time where Amiri Baraka was calling this stuff out as a kind of, as a Black music critic and specifically coming from like Marxist-Leninist traditions and also like different like Islamicist sort of traditions as well. And he very much called out sort of like the white writers and Black musicians kind of thing going on. Um, so it's interesting. I know about some of this stuff in regards to sort of jazz studies, but I don't know all of this stuff regarding sort of rock and roll studies. But it seems like
It's new, you know. We don't have rock and roll, we tend to wait like 50 years or so until we start really getting into something. So this stuff is just really starting to be examined. I think there's a lot of room here for us to for scholars to work with it, especially leftist scholars, um, whose voices are need to be amplified in this space, because we are talking about leftists, when we're talking about the new left, when we're talking about the counterculture, when we're talking about the hippies, anything like that, the rock and roll scene. You can't divorce it from what's going on politically, or you don't understand it.
Of course not. Yeah, the social conditions and the music are sort of like one thing. Just kind of also like what Amiri Baraka was getting at too. There was
Yes.
within the magazine there seemed to be an arch villain and an arch nemesis of sorts, and his name seemed to be Bill Graham. So would you mind discussing a little bit about Bill Graham and sort of how he was positioned and why?
Okay, so Bill Graham is really my entree into talking about hippie capitalism, which is one of my little. If we had subsections, that would be a subsection, right? Hippie capitalism, but we just blended it. Basically, there's this idea in the '60s that one of the views is anti-capitalist, right? But another view is that hippies can do their own kind of capitalism, right? We can have capitalism where people are making money, and we'll just have these sort of parallel institutions, and we'll have our own community in which this money is being circulated and stuff. We can do capitalism in our own hippie way, right? Which I guess calls into question the commitments of hippiedom. I think ultimately when we're talking about hippie capitalism, and I would argue that the hippie part is really that aesthetic part, right? Divorced in some ways from the content of the politics. But Bill Graham, Bill Graham was a guy who owns the Fillmore, right? So these auditoriums where people are playing, big bands. I mean, this is where like the acid tests are happening, and like, I mean, he's the man, right? But he's also this guy who kind of has a corner on what Jann Wenner wants to get a corner on and eventually does, which is trying to make a buck off of these guys, right? And so we see a lot of conflict between him, and it's not just him. Other concert organizers and people sort of in the inner workings of the profession, people who are organizing shows and things like that, are often going to be sort of attacked by Rolling Stone. They're going to complain if they think they're not getting their money's worth at certain events or festivals. They complain when they think that Bill Graham is ripping off the rock and roll community. Hey, that's our job, kind of thing. And so what we see is that it's almost like he's held up as a bad guy for doing the exact thing that Rolling Stone is going to end up doing. So I think it's a really interesting way to look at what's going on. But in a way, what they're saying by like teasing this stuff out is there's a correct way to be a capitalist and be a hippie. You can do it. You can do it. You can hold both of those commitments. These people are doing it wrong, right? So we're going to criticize them for being bad hippie capitalists, but we can do hippie capitalism correctly. You can trust us on that, right? And so you can rely on them to be your sort of moral guide when it comes to what is okay and not okay to profit from in the hippie music space. So I think it's interesting. I think there's some pot kettle black going on in some of these cases, but there's also negotiation, right? We're trying to negotiate where we stand, what we can talk about, what people agree with, what people don't agree with, where we can, how far we can go with like the profit motive. Let's see what we can pull people along on, right? I'm not saying it's self-conscious like that, but I think that's how it works, right?
Yeah, no, that's great. When I was reading that part, I just thought, okay, this is one of those an accusation is an admission actually thing going. Like, they're
Yes.
by couching all of this stuff and indexing it within the figure of Bill Graham, it's sort of like, okay, I think they're actually really talking about what they might be up to as well. And there's like a
Setting the limitations, right? Here we're going to try and create our little space right now and negotiate its boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. And also, yeah, define it and foreclose it before it really can be. And if they're the ones sort of setting like the ideological framing of things, I guess that's what it means by capturing the market. They're also like saying this is how you correctly do and purchase capitalism. I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned that while there was this overall sort of like anti-capitalistic thing going on with the hippie movement writ large with different various sort of political tendencies and commitments and stuff. They would think of purchasing certain products as an act of solidarity. So, for instance, like buying a rock and roll record or getting tickets to something wasn't like necessarily a purchase without meaning behind it. Like there was a thing sort of, and it was like purchasing into what you want to see and into a community.
That's what Jann Wenner has to do, right? That's exactly what he has to figure out how to do. He has to figure out how to get that cash that is not only signaling we like rock and roll, but specifically the cash from the people who are saying we love rock and roll and we're a part of the counterculture. Okay, so absolutely. I think that he he has to understand them very deeply in order to create what is going to become. I mean, I don't even know what the valuation is right now, but by the 1970s, I think we're at over $100 million for Rolling Stone. They're moving to New York to skyscraper. I mean, like, so there has to be some sort of consciousness of, I think, some self consciousness there too. I think that maybe pushing those boundaries a little. It's okay. Yeah, buying this magazine is an act of leftist solidarity. It's not, you can be anti capitalist and still give me your money. That's fine.
Yeah, it's sort of maniacally brilliant, very much so. It creates like
He
an
is.
alternative.
He is. He's brilliant. He's brilliant. Like he really is. If I was a business person instead of a music historian, I'd be sitting here calling him a genius, like a marketing genius, advertising. He is.
Yeah, I know in the article he's also referenced as a wunderkind, which
Yeah.
bears his claim out very much so. Um, Now, this actually I found was another thing I found striking within this, and I didn't really think about before, but Rolling Stone and other sort of magazines like it actually had a significant impact on the way in which rock and roll was canonized and historicized, and later seems like
Yeah.
narrativized within history textbooks and stuff like this. And the way we even think about it now, the Beatles and Bob Dylan play an outstanding role because of Jan sort of sucking up two different sort of tastemakers and people that were famous and him being the groupie. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I was hoping we could go there from where we were because it's just really the logical continuation of the project, right? And I think in a way I actually came to this in reverse, because I wanted to understand how Rolling Stone had such, this disproportionate impact on not only music but also politics, right? So before we even talk about canonization, I mean, we would never have a Jimmy Carter presidency in 1976 if it wasn't for Rolling Stone. So the political and the economic goals are very quickly going to sort of get meshed in together. And we're also going to see that as he earns more and more money, because he does have his political commitments, which I would argue are liberal political commitments rather than leftist, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of where I land on it. I don't think that he's right wing or anything like that. I just think he's more of a liberal and not a leftist. But without them, we don't get a Jimmy Carter campaign because they get all these musicians and like Willie Nelson and stuff to like do these concerts with him, and they promote him big time in the page of the article. I mean, of the magazine. So first of all, they've always sort of had uh, from a very early period, they've sort of realized that they're having this political influence. And I think it makes sense. Ramparts had that. But in order to have that political influence, you have to be able to convince people that you're an authority, right? On this. And you also have to have an understanding of who your audience is, but also who they want to be, right? So you have to like if they're trying to talk to the wrong audience in the wrong way, it's never going to go anywhere. They have a very good idea of sort of um, non-radical commitments of their audience and how to make someone who is non-radical, who may lack those kind of political commitments, still get the thrill of feeling like they're a part of it, right? This sort of like I call it the aesthetics of it, right? Just the feeling of it, the cool look of it, and all of that without the inner work. As far as like canonizing canonicity and stuff goes, this is another area in which we see their influence is outsized, and something that we really need to reckon with. Whenever one thing that I noticed when I was doing my early research in graduate school was that oftentimes for shorthand, in order to describe the importance of a piece of music or an artist, they would simply refer to Rolling Stone. For example, Rolling Stone charts. I have a lot of interest in charting and how charting is just how the history of charting has distorted our understanding of actually what was going on in the past, because I don't think we understand adequately as historians how charting worked, how vested influences influence the charting process, all of that stuff. Okay. So I was like, well, if we just okay, so you want to convince someone that this is an important song, and all you have to do is put in parentheses Rolling Stone number, whatever on their list of guitarists. Well, who's Rolling Stone? Why do we use that as shorthand to say that someone's good? Like, who are these people? Why do we trust them? We don't do that with other things. You don't just say, Time magazine. Well, I guess that's actually a really bad example. Just like refer to like, a magazine, like they like this person, and that's enough to, substantiate that they're an important person. The reason Time magazine is a bad example because being on the cover of Time magazine is actually really important. But so if if you're just referring to Rolling Stone's charts and their lists, for example, every year we see new lists, not even every year, every month, right? Because we're in the social media cycle now. So you have 500 greatest guitarists, and then 3 months later, you have 500 greatest, drummers, and everyone's arguing about it, and we do it over and over again. And Rolling Stone does it not only sort of on social media, but they have made millions by making these books, right? These little compendium, these little list books, right? Or these encyclopedias or this stuff. And what it does is it purports to organize, this information and its importance for us. But what I argue is that we take that way too seriously, because really what we're just seeing is the 60s and 70s culture filtered through the lens of what Jann Wenner likes personally. Like there are other aspects that go into some of these lists and making these lists. But I think that if we look very specifically with regard to the 60s and 70s, perhaps today, I mean, I don't know what he likes today, and that's not really what I studied. But if we look at what he liked in the 60s, right, who he was obsessed with, who he was a groupie for, right, a fanboy, I think we would call it now, for, those are the people who he focused on getting interviews with, who he put on the covers of his magazine, who he put at the top of his list, who he promoted more than the others. And so the culture that we have around us now has been very much shaped by Jann Wenner's personal taste. I'm not saying that Bob Dylan wouldn't be the greatest, whether he liked him or not, or the Beatles, he was a Beatles nut, right? No one's saying that if Jann Wenner didn't like the Beatles, they wouldn't be shit. That's not the argument here. But what I am saying is that there are other artists who people feel are equally valid, interesting, who worked in the lives of actual ordinary people more, who actually probably had bigger influences on the fans than some of the groups that he highlights. Okay. So, one of my advisors is a guy named John Kovacs. He's a wonderful pop historian. He wrote the What's That Sound, History of Rock and Roll. And he loves Yes. Okay, not my thing. I have no interest in Yes personally. No. But he makes a very convincing argument. He's also involved with, the Rock Hall of Fame, which, Jann Wenner is also one of the top people making decisions for the Rock Hall of Fame. And he always wants yes, right? He wants yes to be celebrated more and all of this stuff. Again, like, not my thing. But he makes a very convincing argument. I think that Yes is the best band of all time. And the reason that the vast majority of Americans, don't think that Yes is the best band of all time is because I'm not in charge of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm not in charge of Rolling Stone magazine. You see what I'm saying? So what we see is that it's been weighted really strongly towards his personal preferences. I also argue within the article, and it's harder to put your finger on this, but I also argued that there's certain financial considerations that play into some of how they talk about music, and I believe that influences how we remember music. So, for example, the famous conflict that happened between Lester Bangs and Rolling Stone, they hire Lester Bangs to write a review of Canned Heat. I like Canned Heat. He hated their second record. He said it was crap. And Jann Wenner, tried to force him to change it because Canned Heat had taken out a 2-page ad in that month's magazine. So we have to also understand that as a for-profit enterprise, that they're not sort of doing this purely journalistic, approach to the music. They also are having these musicians advertised in the pages of the magazine. So I think that also can influence what we think is important now when we look back. So if I'm just putting in my paper, my book, Rolling Stone number 15 guitarist or whatever, I'm not really talking about who the best guitarist is. I'm talking about who Jann Wenner thinks is the best guitarist. Then if we want to pin this down even deeper, it goes to the question of, are they really doing rock criticism, right? Are they placing rock and roll in its social, political, and cultural context appropriately, or are they doing consumer reviews? Are they selling records, right? And I also argue that that's a deep problem with the Rolling Stones' approach to music criticism, and I think that is also reflected in canonicity. So there's a lot going on, but the best musician of the 1960s might not be the best-selling musician of the 1960s, right? It might be, they love like Nick Drake or something, so I'm not saying they like ignore it, but oftentimes we see that the most popular groups of the 1960s are also given respect as the most important, and there's not always a one-to-one situation in that. But if we're looking at music reviewing as consumer reviews rather than music criticism, then it makes sense that commercial viability and commercial success would be the pillar on which we're creating this canon that they create and actively create constantly, and it's everywhere, and they make a lot of money off of it. They have defined the 60s and 70s music for our generation for sure. And I think that we take that a little bit too passively. We just kind of say, oh yeah, that's the way it was. But as a rock and roll historian, I don't think that it reflects reality necessarily.
Yeah, that's great. I guess it all gives various historians, historiographers, jobs alike to go through sort of what was happening on the ground and why certain things were considered important, and how obviously social and capital exchanges played a role within that process. This idea of sort of framing, this idea of like creating these books and these lists also frames the very conditions in which artists are discussed, and also sort of
Yes.
values certain aesthetic regimes and aesthetic systems over others. But nonetheless, people take these lists very seriously. Um,
And scholars too, which is the weirdest part, right? So in rock and roll history, you see them referred to as though they're reference books. These are not reference books.
Yeah, no, totally. And then also I was thinking about sort of, you mentioned there's times at which some of the writers actually dig into the sort of mechanics of how the industry and the magazine and the recording studios work together. And I was thinking that this somehow lends itself legitimacy within the counterculture, within Rolling Stone's readership, because it's like, oh, look, we're understanding the social processes at which things sort of emerge, and we're understanding how sort of like it goes, but at the same time, they're positioned very much within this system where the underground is actually working with the above ground and everything is a lie and something like this. So I was wondering, I had this hunch that that writing style and doing that lends them credence in some way.
I think that we have to, I think that's true, but I think we're also, have to believe that sometimes they really think they're doing what they think that, they're saying they really think they're doing what they're saying. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes I think that especially if you're a leftist and you're involved in a movement and you're trying to like coexist with sort of mainstream society or function some way within mainstream society, you make some concessions, you make some changes, and then you can get really confused about where your real values lie. In a way, it's almost like, again, just the aesthetics of the leftists. So in other words, we're going to use this intellectualizing without the actual, bringing in any theory, without bringing in any ultimately at the end of the day, without any political commitments being tied to it. We could intellectualize all we want, we could talk about things all we want, but at the end of the day, it comes down to actions, right? And how these things play out, how it played out in reality with Rolling Stone, for example, is this incredible profit, this incredible amount of extraction. Um, so I'm reluctant. I guess I give them the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes I think that they really believe that they're doing the right thing. Sometimes I think that they're actively co-opting. I think more often than not, though, it's going to fall into the former category, because I just think that human beings are, well, you know what we're like. We're really fallible. So I think that they think this is a way that I can make this work, and in a way, they're losing track of what their commitments might be.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm still figuring out what human beings are like. I haven't put my finger on it yet. I'm working on it. But it makes me think of like while individualistically you could sort of write something that's scathing in different ways, structurally the position might undermine what's being said without sort of realizing it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That is a wonderful, wonderful way to express it. I agree totally. That's exactly what it is. And that's what we have to be conscious of, right? That's why we always have to be like really aware of, you know, and it's hard. I mean, publications, like even for us in academia, right? We make those sacrifices, and then, someone might come along later and look at me and be like, I wonder if she was really committed to this, or if this was just a signal so that, like, it's just, I, 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 I find, I guess it has to do with my general feelings about the new left and the hippies in general. I mean, I find them fascinating. I find them frustrating. I find them annoying. I find them inspiring, right? And it's all in turn. And you're just like, you want to shake them sometimes, but then you're like, well, what am I doing?
No, that's great. I mean, constant self-evaluation is part of the learning process, and learning is absolutely essential to guiding our actions in various ways. I also say really quickly that I taught with John's book in prison, actually. So I teach in prisons, and I taught a rock and roll history class using his textbook. So definitely tell him that like little
I'm going
fun.
to tell him. He would
Yeah,
love that.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's a great text. And he was really good at helping me be crystal clear on that. So I had the print side from Joan Shelley Rubin and the cultural history side. And then he was just so great at helping me be crystal clear on that rock and roll stuff, like really trying to nail that down. So I have to give him his props for sure.
Yeah, no,
Great
great to have
advisors.
dissertation, like a super dissertation team. Totally makes all the
Yeah, it
difference.
really, I wish they just let me stay forever, but now I have to be an early career.
I know what that's like. I know what that's like. So, before we go, thank you so much for your time. I don't want to hold you up, even though I could clearly talk
You're
about
so
this and to
welcome.
you forever. Is there anything we missed that you'd like to say, or any projects you're working on you want to shout out? I know your book is coming out at some point.
Well, I guess I just want to talk about the book in general. And like I have mentioned, sort of the central idea, like sort of the motivating factor or sort of push behind it is that I do view rock and roll criticism in some cases, not all, as the cultural wing of the revolution. I think that we need to take the 60s more seriously than we do. And what I mean by that is that they really did, in many cases, believe that they were fomenting a revolution, that they were working towards a revolution. It didn't come or it didn't happen like they thought it was going to, but they were doing real, concerted political work for, you know, specific reasons. And so I wanted to look and see how people who are working sort of in the cultural fields with rock and roll um, sort of brought those political commitments to what we think of as a really commercialized genre, and it was theirs, and they made it theirs, and they tried to keep a hold of it, and it slips, away from them and into the rest of our possession. Um, but they were doing important work. And I think that because we sort of tend to laugh the hippies off sometimes, we tend to do the same thing with rock and roll. Who cares? We don't look at that as a site of important political writing and important political thought, but it was. I mean, Richard Goldstein is important. But two of my other subjects, Ellen Willis and Lester Bangs. I mean, these are two people who really helped shape, in Ellen Willis's case, politics, and in Lester Bangs's case, culture. So I think we should be taking these figures more seriously, and luckily, I seem to be one of the early people who are doing so. But I think that because we're such a culturally oriented society, that we can't really understand a movement without looking at the cultural wing of it, right? And so that's kind of what I'm doing here. I don't really. Another thing that I'm interested in is like this charting question. I really want to talk about maybe a historiographical essay on how we use charting shorthand and the exact things that I was talking about in sort of with regard to these references to Rolling Stone. Is something that I'm really interested in. Other than that, yeah, I really have a project in mind after this that I want to tackle. There's some stuff that I want to do on hillbilly socialism down in the South in the early part of the 20th century. I'm also interested in tackling a biography of Charles Kuralt. I don't know if you know who he is. He is a CBS reporter from the 1960s. So, I just am excited to have done this, and I love it. But I think that this project for me is complete, in the sense that I'm ready to push it out and then begin to think about what's coming next. But I mean, it took up a good, like 10 years of my life, and it was everything. And it's important. I'm glad that it's out there and getting some attention, and I hope that I can make it into a book. Um, but yeah, I think that what you said is right. There's so much here for scholars, and maybe not me, maybe me, who knows? Depends on what I feel like doing. But, for young scholars, this has not been treated. There are only, in my bibliography, part of my book, I talk about, there's only a handful of books that address this seriously. There are no biographies of most of these people. And so I think that if I could encourage anyone who doesn't really have a direction, that they're going in and they want to study the new left, they want to study cultural history or print culture, anything like that, this is just so rich, and none of it's really been touched because it's new. And I think people are afraid of it too. It's hard to get a grasp on the cultural, political sort of meeting point, the juncture, right? But it's really important that we do, because it has so much of an impact.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, thanks for so many different ideas to inspire further research. I was also thinking like people might not do the sort of hippie stuff because they're predetermined at this point as sort of non-radical because of the ways in which they
Yes.
were positioned by the Black Panther Party. And yeah, so okay, good. I'm glad that landed. Do you have anything you want to say about
We
that?
should take them seriously. They took themselves seriously, and the government took them seriously. So we should take them seriously.
Beautiful. Yeah, well said. I mean, if it upsets the powers that be, we should look into what was going on and perhaps replicate some of that as well. And then I guess the last thought I'll say is that I noticed that a lot of this was actually about the reception and the fans and potential fans rather than the band. So I was wondering what bands lent themselves to sort of like more of a political ethos, and also like even the Beatles had more of these sort of like different kind of commitments and ideas to what like peace and love and a good world would look like. So I think even when writing about the Beatles, I'm not sure how he sort of parsed just talking about the aesthetics as well. But I guess if you want to say anything about fans or bands, and then we could head on.
That's such a really smart catch that you made, because that was a focus that I really wanted to do. Instead of focusing on the artists, the famous people, I wanted to focus on the reception. I wanted to focus on how Americans, and I tried to get perspectives, especially through letters that people would write, on how Americans were receiving this, and how these bands were working in the lives of ordinary people. That's what it's all about. It's not about, the rich and the famous. It's all about the ordinary folks. And um, I think that a lot of times the connection between what the artist intends and what the person receives is disjointed, and not necessarily in line. And I don't think it needs to be. Uh, I think that a lot of people receive, for example, like the Beatles, a lot of them received it apolitically, but some really latched onto those political messages in there. And of course, the Beatles were political. Some of the more political people, like Phil Ox, and like the real, deeply committed, people, couldn't handle a world in which their contributions uh, to music and culture were trivialized, and which and living in a society in which, they were very serious about what they were doing, and it hurts sometimes, some of them not to be taken as seriously. So, I'm a Bob Dylan person myself, not to, be too Winter-esque about it. I think that he really is, the guy who's protesting too much. We know that throughout the 60s and 70s, he's like, I'm not political, totally political the whole time. And I think that, but, in a way, you don't really, I guess that you don't have, the thing is, Rolling Stone doesn't have to talk about the politics of music. It can just talk about the aesthetics. The problem, and it comes back to, the root of the article, is what they're saying they're doing, how they're presenting themselves, how they're selling themselves, right? If they hadn't claimed, through aesthetics and also through words, to be sort of inheritors of this political movement or part of the political movement, we wouldn't be looking for these disconnects as closely. You know what I'm saying? We're not looking in Billboard for the disconnects between politics and culture. So I really think that it's about expectations and reality, and I think it's also about, sort of. I think the audience has always got to be centered, because that's the only way we can understand how these things are truly working, in our society, and the lasting impact that they're going to have. So yeah, I mean, I think music can be political, whether or not the person writing it has good politics, whether they mean to be political, whether they're good, people or not. So I think that it's not that someone has to have perfect politics. It's all about, just the terms in which we're understanding what we're listening to, and how perhaps some people are trying to distort or manipulate what we think we're engaging with, by making it seem more radical than it actually is.
Yeah,
I hope
great.
that answered it.
No, that's a wonderful ending. Yeah, I mean, the main issue being sort of like how they said they were and then what they were sort of thing. Yeah. So
Yes. Yes.
so thank you so much. This was so much fun to chat with you, and I'm looking forward to your upcoming project.
Thank you, Lee. I'll stay in touch with you, and we can chat anytime. I love to chat about history. You can
Me
tell.
too. Well, I'm sure we will. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Lee.